I don't want to be overdramatic, but we are facing a real threat. And it really does illustrate that there is a very profound crisis at the heart of the EU. To say that this speech has not been ratified by the Ministry for Narrative Control. And if there are any independent fact-checkers who are getting funded by the Commission, who are in the audience who want to check no doubt you'll be pointing out factual errors. But this, seriously, it's a joke and you laugh, but that is really what's going on here. That we have an approved script that dictates to us what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, what is legitimate and what's delegitimized as a political outlook. And that's really what I want to examine in a bit of detail, because when you think about it, the Commission, and this is just, I have to say as well, is just the tip of the iceberg. The projects that we've uncovered, 349 that I was able to pull together, to the tune of 650 million euros, is really just the tip of an iceberg, because so much more of this funding is hidden in other projects and in other databases. This information was gleaned from the tenders portal and from the Cordis, from the database. But there's other databases that we haven't yet analysed, where we do know that there are other projects that don't go under the title of hate speech or disinformation, but nevertheless play to the same narrative. And in the report I mentioned the fact that if you look under mental health, you discover that there's many projects. I mean, I found something like 240, some of which, when you look at them, have a very tangential relationship to mental health, but have got everything to do with preparing young people about how to handle social media and hate speech online. And suddenly you realize that when you analyze these projects, they are very much part of this narrative of, in particular, what's more insidious about them is that they are geared towards young people. And it's the kind of attitude of what they call inclusivity, co-creation, all these, mealy-mouthed terms that they use, which actually disguise the fact that what they're doing, what they're aiming to do, is to indoctrinate young people to think in what I call NEU speak, newspeak, in the Orwellian sense of being the opposite of what it really means. It's very important to understand that they are spending a significant amount of money, but even more significant is the fact that they're spending more on this than they do on cancer research, cross-border cancer research in Europe. And it just kind of shows you what the priority is here, what the chilling priority really is, that they are more afraid and fearful of free speech than they are of actually doing research that could stop over 2 million deaths a year in Europe from cancer. And, it kind of says to me that there is a real fear factor here. This is not incidental. This just didn't come about by accident. This is designed. This is purpose-driven to ensure that the narrative that they want people to adopt is the one that is made legitimate and is aired. This report does uncover an important point about taxpayers' money and the way that it's being used in a really unaccountable fashion for these projects. But the report, I think, what's more important about the report is the democratic deficit, the democratic threat that this represents. That this is a real wake-up call, because it really hides the fact that there is a systematic assault on free speech in Europe, which is really the foundation of democracy. What I call the Ministry of Narrative Control is this network, and Jacob mentioned how this network works. The point about the network, and I suppose this is an important point for people to understand, is that it's a self-fulfilling recursive loop. Because what they do is they fund organizations who do so-called research, and I'll come back to that in a minute, who basically prove that hate speech exists, that it's a real threat to the future of democracy. And every one of these projects and reports ends with the assertion, more research needs to be done. We need to uncover more, because a lot of hate speech is hidden. And of course, the reason why hate speech is so difficult to uncover is not because people are deliberately trying to hide it. It's because no one can define what hate speech is. And hate speech is in the words of whoever decides what hate speech is. That's what hate speech becomes. And if you look at the history of how it's moved from racism to religion, and then to gender, and it's like every week there's a new minority group who are now represented as being under the threat of hate. Like tall people, people with ginger hair, fat people. We're all, it's an ever-expanding universe. And what happens is that everybody who then takes money and gets involved in these projects then just basically confirms what the Commission has already asserted, which is that this is a problem. And therefore, the circle just gets repeated again and again, and more funding is put into this because it proves that there is this big problem. This is, I think, probably the most important point about the report, is the use of language, how they are determining the language that is legitimized, that through which we understand our politics and free speech. Because this is not an attack on disinformation, as they claim it to be. This is actually an attack on dissent. This is not an attack on hate speech. It's an attack on free speech. And that's what we should understand. But what they're really doing is they're outlawing dissent because they're saying that the language that is being used, for example, in support of national sovereignty or in opposition to the Green Deal is far-right hate speech or disinformation, that this therefore is something that is ruled out of order and should not be repeated by normal people. This means that what they're really doing is they are controlling the range of thought and what is legitimate dissent within the heart of Europe. And that means that this is a fundamental attack on democracy, on the right for ideas to be contested, for there to be debate, for there to be clarification of issues, that important issues that face the people of Europe. So it's a top-down, curated consensus, very authoritarian, which basically means, and of course it's always done in the name of defending free speech. And what they mean, or freedom of expression is the term that they like to use. What that really means is that this consensus is only allowed where you express freely the views, the language of compliance established by the Commission. That's really what they mean by freedom of speech, that you're free to utter their truths, not any other truth. And that is a very, very, it's a fundamentally dishonest approach to politics, where euphemism is spoon-fed to the public, this newspeak where the intention of things is disguised by this kind of really cuddly, lovely language that they use. As you can see in the acronyms, if you read the report that we've published, you get these lovely acronyms like FAST LISA. FAST LISA actually stands for Fighting Hate Speech Through a Legal, ICT and Socio-Linguistic Approach. I mean, that's fantastic, isn't it? It's a kind of you can imagine the academics sitting around, how much time they must spend coming up with these names. And really what it's about is actually, it's a re-education protocol for young people who are not trained to think critically, but to become local agents, and they actually use this terminology of a new speech orthodoxy. That's what FAST LISA stands for. We have this project called Vigilant. Sounds vigilant. This is Vital Intelligence to Investigate Illegal Disinformation. This is a €3.3 million project, basically giving the police the right to scrape data and create a database of law enforcement that uses machine learning to determine whether your tweet is a micro-incitement or a microaggression. And this is what this project's about. It's about giving law enforcement the right to determine, what is, correct speech or not, vigilant. When I looked at this in more detail, what really struck me was how even we who are critical of this have been drawn into this language, how they've policed our language itself. If you just take the Digital Services Act as a starting point. I mean, I wrote a report before this on controlling the narrative, where I just repeated, the Digital Services Act, as if it's just fairly obvious, benign. It's just another piece of legislation, whatever. But when you analyze it and you see Digital Service Act. It's not the Digital Speech Act. It's not the Digital Surveillance Act, which in fact really what the act is about. The services is like a Trojan horse that really disguises something fundamental, which is that this is an assault on speech, that this is a piece of legislation that determines that the Commission and the unaccountable social media companies should determine what can or cannot be said online, and that if you do not comply with this, you will face fines, etc. Services, you think about it, it's like, it makes out like, these social media companies are like utilities. It's like they're delivering water, they're delivering electricity. We're not talking about water and electricity, we're talking about the fundamental right to speech, democratic right to voice your opinions. That's what's being serviced. And so the way that the Commission can present this is that they are just simply in the process of ensuring that there is refined and good service delivery. So it's like they're rationing speech as a commodity rather than a right. And they are determining who can and cannot say, what's legitimate, what's illegitimate. We just use this term as if it's just of unimportance, but it is absolutely fundamental to the whole establishment of a narrative that is in essence anti-democratic, that is in essence cutting down debate rather than opening it. The idea that your research is there to provide collaborated answers rather than uncover anything new, that all you're doing is proving the assumption of it really completely denigrates the concept of research and the university and the corruption of that. And it really does illustrate that there is a very profound crisis at the heart of the EU, where they have to spend this kind of money to manufacture this narrative, which just indicates that it's not something that's organic to the way life is in Europe and the way ordinary people look at things. And of course, this is really what it's about, ladies and gentlemen. This is about dictating to the masses, to the demos, what can and cannot be said, because the EU, as far as they're concerned, they know what's right. We, the people, don't have moral independence. We don't have the ability to think for ourselves. We need to be nudged. We need to be controlled. We need to have our thoughts marshaled in a particular way. And that's really what this is all about. So I would end on one note, and that's this. And I think if we want to resurrect democracy in Europe, we have to go back to the old values of Europe, the Enlightenment values of someone like Spinoza, whose great statement is the one that we should emblazon on our banners in Europe, which is that every man should be free to think what he likes and say what he thinks. That's what we should be arguing for. This is not just a quote. This is a litmus test for civilization, for democracy. Because if we cannot say what we think, then we will soon forget how to think at all.